Stephen and I just had a secret conference. I would tell you what it was, but it's secret. I was afraid that I had offended him during his table talk because he looked at me a couple of times and I'm going. And I'm sure he took that as meaning, what am I saying? But see, that's how I listen. When I'm really trying to concentrate, I've turned my good ear to whoever's talking. It's like, so this morning, if I see some of y'all going, I'll just assume you're listening very, very close. When you get a chance today, be sure to read the article in the bulletin. If you're listening online, you can read it online. It's actually already posted. Don't do it now, but read it sometime today. It's a good introduction to what we're going to talk about in the sermon. In fact, it was the introduction until it got sort of long and unwieldy, so I turned it into the bulletin article. But basically, the point is how our culture, our economic system, our financial system depends on us working harder and harder to make more and more money, to spend more and more money on things we don't really need for people that already have everything. So just read that article. Let me illustrate. This past week, I did my taxes. Actually, Monday, I did my taxes. Did better than usual. I've got it in like hours before the deadline. This year, however, I ended up owing a little more to the feds than I usually do. And the reason was the COVID stimulus check. This happened to anybody else? If the government was going to ask for part of it back, why didn't they just keep it to begin with, rather than giving it to me and say, oh, by the way, give it back? Of course, the reason for the stimulus check is that because of the pandemic and other things, the supply chain issues, business had slowed way down. The economy was not going well, and so the idea is that we give more and more money to people. Well, they'll turn around and spend it, thus stimulating the economy, right? Like I say, our whole system depends on spending more and more money, even if you don't need what it is that you're buying. The system depends on us buying more. Did anybody use your stimulus check to put into savings or to spend down existing debt? Communists. No, the system depends on us spending more and more money, even if we don't need anything. Well, after taking a break for Easter and Palm Sunday before that, we're back to our study of the book of Exodus, which we actually started way back in early fall. We've been methodically working our way through Exodus. When we got to Exodus chapter 20, we slowed down to take a week each on each of the Ten Commandments. And this morning we are ready for the 10th of the Ten Commandments as we finish that look. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, this commandment is completely different from the ones that we've been looking at just before it. When thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. Those are all regulating behavior. That's usually what the law does. It regulates acts that are in violation of the law. But covet is regulating thoughts. It's sort of like the thought police. To covet takes place in your heart. It's to look at something that someone else has and have a longing stirred that you want that, or you want something like that, or you want to spend more and more money that you don't have on things that you don't need. It's a thought. How do you regulate thoughts? Well, there's an old joke of two East German border guards at the Berlin Wall before communism fell. And one of them turns to the other as they're standing at attention. One turns to the other and says, "So, comrade, what do you think of our regime?" And the second one says, "I don't know. I think the same thing that you do." And the first one says, "Then it's my duty to arrest you." You can't really hold somebody accountable for thoughts. There is no real thought But essentially, that's what God is telling us here. That thou shalt not commit adultery is, well, how do you know? I mean, thou shalt not covet. That is, how do you know when somebody has coveted your stuff? I remember when Tressa was in elementary school. One of the young guys that followed her all the way up through school, in the middle of class, out of nowhere, he was wearing this big medallion thing around his neck, and he just all of a sudden blurted out to the teacher, "Make Tressa stop staring at my medallion." Well, how can you tell if somebody is staring at your house, your ox, or your donkey? If somebody steals your car, you know that. You go out and your car's not there. Or if you're like me, you just forgot where you parked it. But something's actually happened. How can you tell? Is it by action? If somebody goes out and buys a new car, oh man, they must have been coveting that new car for a long time. Suppose I go out and buy myself a brand new, shiny red Ford F-150 pickup truck with all the extras. You'd go, we must be paying him too much. Or he doesn't practice what he preaches. But if Bob Bean goes out and buys that same truck, half of us would be saying, finally, Bob got a new truck. And the other half of us would be saying, who are you? What have you done with Bob? It really does depend on who it is and the situation. You can't gauge by behavior whether or not someone is being covetous. Well, let's go ahead and look at the commandment and then make applications, not to me and Bob, but to all of us as we look at this commandment, thou shalt not covet. What does it mean to covet? It's an interesting, covet, seeing something that somebody else has. Obviously, the focus here is looking at your neighbor's stuff and wanting to possess it. But the Hebrew word that is used here literally means to take pleasure in, and interestingly, it's used in many positive cases in the Old Testament. In other words, you can covet things legitimately. It can be sometimes be really good to covet some things. For example, Psalm 19 and verse 10, they, the commandments and precepts of God, they are more precious than gold, more than pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. Well, the word precious is the word for covet. You are to covet. They are more to be coveted than gold, than pure gold, the commands and precepts of God. We are to covet those. And then in Song of Songs, now don't read this too carefully. There's a lot of metaphor. This can be embarrassing. But like the apple tree among the trees of the forest is my beloved among young men. I covet. I delight to sit in his shade and in the fruit so sweet to my taste. Okay, the lover here is coveting her beloved, and he is to be to take in delight in. And then Daniel 9 verse 23, this is an angel talking to God. As soon as you began to pray, a word went out, which I have come to tell you, for you are coveted. You are highly esteemed. So there is a sense in which we can covet something. And so obviously in the commandment, part of the desire, the taking delight in what it is that turns it into the sin of coveting is not only what it is, but the situation and who it belongs to. It is to look at your neighbor and what he's been blessed with and to desire that for yourself. Another illustration of this dual meaning of covet can be seen the very first two times that it's used in the Hebrew Bible. The very first two times has to do with the Garden of Eden and with trees and their fruit. So in Genesis 2, verse 8, now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east of Eden, and there he had put the man he had formed. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing. That's the word for covet. To the eye and good for food. So God creates this Edenic paradise to place humankind, which is the crowning jewel of his creation. And he places certain trees in there, and he makes sure that they are pleasing. Their fruit is pleasing to humankind. That's the first time that the root word for covet is used in the Hebrew Bible. The second time, same setting, Garden of Eden, trees, fruit. But now rather than being a positive, it becomes a negative. When the woman saw the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable, there's our word again, for gaining wisdom, she took some of it and ate. She gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Okay, here there is a forbidden tree, the one rule God has of all of these trees that are pleasing to the eye, these trees that are coveting to the eye, that are pleasing to you. You can eat them, but this one tree, you're not to eat of it. So Eve sees it, and because of the tempter, she finds it to be coveted. See, what makes it wrong is that she's not to possess it. It's not hers to have. God has forbidden it. And that makes this taking delight in a negative thing. Paul makes the same point in Galatians chapter 5 when he's talking about the fruit of the Spirit, the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit, how we're to follow the way of the Spirit. So he says this in verse 16, "So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with one another, so that you are not to do whatever you want." We have a choice, he says, to walk by the flesh or by the Spirit, according to the sinful natures, the desires that wants what it wants when it wants it, and the Spirit that wants us to do the things of God. And he says that the Spirit, or the flesh rather, desires. That's the Greek word for covet. The flesh covets what's according to the flesh. Our bodies want what it wants when it wants it. We want our way. We want to gratify, and that's why I'm having so much trouble, losing weight after COVID, because cheesecake still looks good. Our flesh wants what it wants when it wants it. It covets according to the flesh. The Spirit covets that which is according to God. So we have to choose which of those natures we are to gratify. The desire that becomes covet is not wrong. It's depending where that desire is pointing. James seems to think it's our desires that are at the root of all of our problems with disunity and disharmony and arguing. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? The word desire there is the word from which we get hedonism. We're all a bit of a hedonist. We all have that sinful nature that wants what it wants. And he says that our conflicts, our fights and quarrels come when those desires start conflicting, the pull to do what's right, the pull to get what we want. And he said that causes us to fight. So he continues, you desire what you do not have. You covet what you do not have. That's the same word we just saw earlier. So that you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. All right, we desire what we don't have, he says, so we kill. Hopefully, he's speaking metaphorically here. I kind of think if they had a big issue in the church that he's writing to where people were killing each other in church, he probably would have addressed this subject just a little bit differently. But he's talking about relationships. He's talking about the quarrels and fights that destroy relationships and unity in the church. There was a situation in our local area 20 years or so ago where in a small storefront church, the pastor and one of the board of deacons or whatever got into a fight after church on a Wednesday night, and the board of director guy killed the preacher and burned down the church building. Not that I'm trying to give anybody ideas or anything. So it's not outlandish that our quarrels can get to the point where there's, physical. But I don't think that's what he's talking about. You desire so much that you're willing to destroy relationships in order to get what you want because of your covetousness. So he goes on in into verse 2 and verse 3. You do not have because you do not ask God. And when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. That's that word for hedonism again that we saw back in verse 1. Okay, so you don't have, and therefore are driven to fuss and fight and metaphorically kill each other because you're not entrusting yourself to prayer. You don't ask God, or you don't ask with the kind of humility that waits on God to answer your prayers. You ask with the wrong motives because you're only driven by your covetousness, by your pleasures. We don't trust God to give us what we need, and so that drives us. And that's the power, the negative power of coveting, is that we can be driven in the wrong direction and we forget all about God. Ultimately, covetousness is all about distrusting God in his ability to divide up blessings. It's when I look at my neighbor's pile of stuff, their house, their ox, their donkey, their wife, their 401k, their looks, their popularity, whatever it is, and I think, well, God messed up. He should have given me that pile. He should have given them this little pile that I have. God did not give me the things that I need. Coveting ultimately is a lack of faith in the distribution of God, of blessings that he gives to each of us. Lynn and I have recently started a practice of anytime we go out to eat, we share a meal at the restaurant, because one of us needs to lose weight. She's always the one in charge of dividing up the food. So the food comes and we push the food over to her and she starts dividing. And I look at her, because ultimately, she always gives me the larger portion, always, which seems to be at odds with why it is we're dividing up the food to begin with. I made sure we weren't going out to eat today because this probably wouldn't be good to remind her of. Do I trust her to divide up the meal and give me what I need? Well, that's what the problem is with us and God when we covet. We ultimately don't really trust him. We think he's going to give us too small of a slice of the pie. If we really trust God, if we pray, as James tells us, and trust that God answers our prayers, then covetousness is not going to be the big issue. So what is the difference between desiring something, just wanting something? It's not wrong to want something, and coveting, which is what we're talking about today. What's the difference between the two of them? And there's a huge difference, but they kind of look the same sometimes, don't they? It's not wrong to want something. In fact, the Bible never says that it's wrong to have something. The command that we're looking at says, don't covet your neighbor's house, his ox, or his donkey. It doesn't say that your neighbor is wrong for having a house, an ox, and a donkey. In fact, the fact that he has a house, an ox and a donkey, probably means at some point he thought, I think I'll get me a house, an ox, and a donkey. He wanted it. So why is it wrong for him to want the house, the ox, and the donkey? And it's not wrong, but it is wrong for me to want his. Again, we go back to what James says, you do not have because you do not ask God. Seems to be perfectly legitimate for us to pray sincerely and humbly, oh Lord, won't you give me a house, an ox, and a donkey? But what we can't do is at the one and the same time is pray to God faithfully and humbly and gripe about the fact that I ain't got no donkey. Complain about what he has given us. We have to either trust God or we don't. And that's, I think, at the issue that with coveting is that, number one, we're not as thankful for all the things that we do have. And number two, we don't really trust God that he's going to give us what we really need. Ever so often, in fact, multiple times through the years, people have come to me and asked me, when do you know it's time to stop asking God to give you the house or ox or donkey or whatever? Because, Paul got to the point where he knew it was time to stop praying that God was going to heal his thorn in the flesh. So when is it that we've been pestering God and pestering God and pestering God? When do we know that it's time to stop asking? And my answer has always been the same. If God ever tells you you can stop asking for that, then you can stop asking for it. It was God that told Paul, my grace is sufficient. You don't need to be healed of this thorn in the flesh. Paul didn't have to come to that realization on his own. We can continue to pray. Remember, it was years and years and years after they began praying for a son that God gave John the Baptist to his parents. Had they stopped praying? We don't know. Had they given up hope? We don't know. But Zechariah and Elizabeth prayed, and eventually God came through. So we need to trust in God that in His own time and in His own process will hear our prayers and answer. It's not our job to try to figure out what's legitimate to pray for, but we need to trust what it is that God has given us. We need to hear what Paul says to the rich in 1 Timothy 6. Now, we'll probably, first response is, we're not really rich. Intellectually, yeah, compared to all the people in the world, compared to what our brothers and sisters in Ukraine are going through, we are blessed and wealthy beyond comparison. But we still want to add, but compared to people here, we're not rich. But I think if we listen to what Paul says, in the first part of the chapter, he talks to people that aren't rich, but just want to be. Those who would get rich, he says, that's where he says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. He says that those who would be rich can leave the faith and pierce themselves through with many sorrows and that kind of thing. But at the end of the chapter, he turns to Timothy and says, okay, now tell those who are rich. Now, even though we might want to argue that we're not, I think there's some things that we can learn by listening to what he says to the rich here. First, he says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Okay, he says, command those who are rich not to put their hope or their trust in those things. Now, we're not rich. If you've ever known a really wealthy person, there can be, we'll put it that way, there can be an arrogance that my station in life, my money, my privilege should lead to certain things. The richest man in the world, Elon Musk, is threatening, he is in the process of trying to buy Twitter so that he can say what he wants on Twitter. I mean, that's kind of presumptive to think, I need to own this so I can tweet whatever I want. Most of us probably haven't had that thought. But some of us that aren't rich can continue to think, when I get to the point when I've got this promotion, if I get to the spot where this rank is given, or when I get to the point where this raise comes through, then we're going to be in a position. See, you can hope in things you don't have yet. We can live our entire lives thinking if we just get to the next station, then things will be okay. And Paul says, don't hope in things that are so transient, that can be taken away so quickly. Put your trust in God, who richly provides everything. Understand that God wants us to enjoy the things that we do have. We can be robbed of the opportunity to enjoy the little pile that we have if we're always looking to the time when we'll get the next biggest pile. Enjoy what you have. Don't put your trust in it, though. Put your trust in God. He goes on to say, command them, the rich people, which we've already agreed we're not, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. God blesses us in order to be able to bless others. In fact, Paul tells the Ephesians, those that have been stealing, don't steal anymore, work hard, earn, so that you can share with those who don't. The fact that God puts things in our hand, He puts it there so that we can share. And we're thinking, that's rich people ought to do that. Well, the chances are pretty good that if you're not generous and willing to share the little that you have, you're not going to be generous and willing to share even if you had more. Old story about the little guy that goes with his mom in church, and there's a missionary there, and he's talking about his mission work and showing pictures of all the poor children that he works with. And the little boy is moved to tears. He's so moved by those pictures. As he's leaving, they're walking home. He tells his mom, if I ever get any money, I'm going to give it to the missionary so he can help those kids. About that time, the wind blows, and there's a dollar bill that comes sort of rolling down the sidewalk. And the little kid runs and grabs it, and before his mom can say a word, he runs off to a store to buy a pack of baseball cards. Yeah, we can say, if we had stuff, we would give stuff. Well, the truth is, we have stuff. And Paul was telling us to be generous and willing to share. And then he repeats Jesus' words about where it is we're going to save our stuff. In this way, they, the rich people who are generous and willing to share, will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so they may take hold of the life that is truly life. What is it that you're saving up for? New house? An ox, a donkey, or heaven? What Paul was reminding us here, of what Jesus has already told us, is that the only way that we can send the physical blessings that God has given us is to use it to do good deeds, to bless others, to be generous and willing to share, as he just said. Fred White likes to remind us if we're too busy to prepare for heaven, we might be too busy to go. And what Paul reminds us of is how we use the physical things that God gives us is one way that we prepare for the next life. The only way to convert earthly wealth into heavenly wealth is to use it for God. God is getting ready to finally lead his people into their promised land. There's going to be a lot of bumps and bruises along the way, and we're going to see some of those as we continue in the book of Exodus. But he is going to fulfill his promise to Abraham that the land in which Abraham is wandering is going to be the property of his descendants, and that of those descendants there's going to be a great nation. As Israel moves in and possesses the promised land, God fulfills his promise. But you'll recall that part of that promise was through Abraham, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Well, Israel never really bought into that. Through Abraham, God was going to bless all of the world through Abraham, through his descendants, and particularly through the Messiah that would come from those descendants. Israel never understood that. They never bought into it. They saw their status as the chosen people of God as privilege. We're the chosen people of God, and you're not. They were blessed by God to bless others. They didn't understand that. We've been blessed by God to bless others. Not to hoard what we have, but to use it for him and for others. Because Israel focused only on their status and their privilege, eventually they would lose their nation. The warning for us today is that we've been blessed to bless others, and may God help us to keep this world of things in its proper perspective, to enjoy all of the good things that God gives us, but to understand the responsibility we have, not to covet, but to be generous and willing to share. As we sing this next song, if there is a spiritual need that you have that you would like prayers for, if there is something that you need to express to the elders, maybe to go back into a room and pray with them about, they'll be at the back of the auditorium as we sing this next song. If you, because of your faith in Jesus, are ready to start a life walk with him, and you're ready to claim him as your Savior, you have faith in him and are ready to be baptized, also go to the back as we sing this song and make that known to the elders. Let's stand and sing together.